Today we're looking at a pretty obscure synthesizer that's obscure not only for its relationship to other synthesizers at the time, but also the category of synthesis it belongs to. Let's talk about it. Hi, I'm Zach Marr from Alamo Music here in San Antonio, Texas. You can find us online at alamomusic.com. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button, turn on your notifications. This is our Alamo Sound Lab channel where we talk about all things music tech related. And today we're looking at the Yamaha SK30. And I have to admit, this is one of my favorite synths that I've researched, primarily because it was so difficult and there was so much misinformation. I felt like I was actually potentially going to do some good on the interwebs by clearing up some of the misconceptions around this series in particular. So this synth is part of our series, The Synths That Time Forgot, and it's forgotten for two reasons. One, because it is not the well-known of this style of synth. It is not the most well-known. The ARP Quadra and the Korg Trident are much more well-known as kind of symphonic ensemble type synths, which were really like 3 or 4 synth engines in a single instrument. So early multi-timbrality, proto-Rompler, even before kind of we got into the digital, early proto-Rompler digitals, these were kind of people's dream to have multiple instruments in a single instrument. You had it in these early kind of symphonic ensemble style instruments. So it's obscure because it wasn't the most successful or the most well-known in that category of instrument, and because that category in general was not super successful and was not really the dominant style of synth that came out at that time. These came out at the late 70s, early 80s, when you were the legendary polyphonic synths, which was a very different route, came out in the legendary subtractive polyphonic synths like the Prophet 5 and the Jupiter 8 and the Jupiter 4 and the Oberheims, the OBX, the OBXA. That was really where synthesis headed before it went to the digital realm and to Romplers. Those were the kind of hot commodities that everybody wanted. These were an evolution out of organ technology, and part of the evolution of monosynths to trying to make synths that were polyphonic, combo organs, kind of portable organ technology, and these were stringers that used divide down synthesis like you find in organs that had a lot of limitations. You had phase locking and kind of limitations in the sounds that you were able to create, and a lot of frustration. You had a ton of polyphony. It was easy to get polyphony, but it was hard to get cool sound sculpting that you found in instruments like the Prophet 5. And so there's a whole category of instruments like the RS505 from Roland, and there's a couple vocoders from Roland as well in that category that are legendary, the Selena. There's a whole bunch of them, and they often are associated with combo organs, which were the portable organs, all emerging out of organ tech, but all of that eventually, and then monosynth at the same time were being explored. And what that ultimately led to at about the same time was these ensemble units and the polyphonic synths that are kind of the legendary golden era polyphonic synths. So these are obscure because they kind of were not they were not super successful comparatively. They were expensive, and it wasn't the path that synthesis took after that. Arguably, it got picked back up when you got multi-timbral digital synths that had as many parts as you wanted, but that's kind of that's a stretch for me to say that. You can see it, that musical wish in these instruments, but is there a clear line between them and those later synths? I don't know. In my opinion, maybe. Would love to hear your thoughts. So let's talk about the SK30. Appreciate you listening to all that history. But the SK30, what's interesting about it? It's interesting, it comes from, the technology in it is called pass technology, and it's a form of synthesis that Yamaha devised, and it stands for specifically pulse analog synthesis system. And the best way to understand pass synthesis, and again, I'm thankful for 2 commenters on our previous video on the SK15, Ald and my friend Funk Pilot, who linked to some articles and looked at them with me, and we came to the conclusion together that these synths are best understood as what DCOs were to VCOs. So VCOs were inherently unstable, and voltage-controlled oscillators were inherently unstable, and digitally controlled oscillators were invented to help analog oscillators have better tuning control. And so it used digital control of the analog sound source to create more stable oscillators. That's what's going on in the SK series. Yamaha created kind of a proprietary IC to utilize digital control over analog sound sources. It was divide down synthesis on a chip, so to speak. So it's what DCOs are to VCOs. The technology in the SK series is to more primitive divide down pure analog circuitry. So that's what's going on. There's a lot of misinformation on the web about it being FM synthesis, about it being a digital sound source. No, these are analog sound sources with a lot of digital control. They also use digital control in the keyboard to kind of reduce the amount of circuitry in the kind of architecture. And so there's a lot of kind of interesting uses of digital technology, but not in this actual sound modules. The effects on it are analog, as is the core sound source. So that was helpful to get that confirmation. I hope that clears it up. And if you have more information, please share it below. I think this is one of those things that there's a lot of bad information on the web. I hope that is helpful. So let's talk about this in particular. The sound engine is loosely based on the Electones. PASS was developed in 1977, I think, and this came out in 1980. And it was in Yamaha's kind of premium home organ line, the Electone. And they took it and they put it in this combo organ slash symphonic ensemble instrument. And there's a whole series. There's a SK10, 15, 20, a 30, and a 50D. And this is the one everybody says you should get because the 50D has 2 keyboards, but this thing is huge and heavy. I can't imagine how big and heavy the 50D is. You can attach a Leslie speaker. You can also attach foot pedals, I think, to control the part of one of the instruments in here. And what's cool about this one in particular, it's got a polysynth section, it's got an organ section, it's got a string section, and it has a solo section, which is a VCO. The polysynth section and the string section are really primitive. It's paraphonic. I think it's just one filter that controls the entire thing. And the string section, there's almost no controls at all. The organ is pretty cool. It's got some percussive elements, and it's got a lot of different kind of flutes that you can use to kind of sculpt the sound. It has analog effects, tremolo, and ensemble for both the organ and the polysynth section. The outs, it has individual outs for the solo, the polysynth, and the organ section, which is one of the cool features about this style of synth. You can do 3 outs and kind of pan them to get interesting kind of stereo effects. The string and polysynth section are the same out, and it's really using the same circuitry, so it's kind of weird, but it works. It's a 12 dB filter on this, which is nice, kind of unique. It's resonant 12 dB filter, low pass. It actually has a band pass as one of the feat selection for the polysynth section, which is odd. I don't really understand what they did there. So it's cool though. So there's some interesting, unique things about this. And I have to admit, when we played the SK15, I thought it was cool. I enjoyed it. I got the SK30 mainly because these are somewhat obscure and because there's not a ton of them out there and there's not a lot of good information. I happened to find one for relatively cheap for the same price that I paid for the SK15. And I was like, I couldn't resist a good deal, and my curiosity got the better of me. And I wasn't expecting to like it particularly more than the SK15, but This one sounds substantially different than the SK15, and even in the sections it shares. So it's a very different sounding, and the VCO and the string section and the poly, it just sounds really nice. And I was really surprised even more when we were playing with it in the studio. Spoiler alert, we have a Korg Trident in the studio as well, and we are shooting these back to back, and we shot the Korg Trident first, and then we did the SK30, and I was surprised when I was doing it at home and playing with the two, I liked the Trident substantially more. But today in the studio with the SK30, I really found a sweet spot, and I was impressed with the way it sounds. It works, it's very pleasant, and it's very clean, and it's very articulate. The thing is behemoth. It's probably one of the biggest synths we've had in the studio. We've had a Memory Moog, we've had a Jupiter 8, we've had some heavy synths. It's not as heavy as those, but I think it's bigger. I think this is actually potentially, and it's just long. It's big, it's bulky. It's not super heavy, but it's a big boy. So cool synth. It has aftertouch, and you can route it to vibrato and brilliance and modulation for the VCO section, which is another cool thing. You can also control the VCO with an outside sequencer. And people online sometimes refer this as a gateway drug to the CS70, which is kind of the heir to the CS80. So it's like there's a fan community around these, but they're still fairly obscure and fairly rare, and there's not modern clones or VSTs that I'm aware of. Well, I think there might be some VSTs, but there's not a lot of clones or interest in recreating this style of ensemble, stringers, symphonic instruments. And largely because it's kind of primitive divide-down technology, which isn't super in vogue for whatever reason. Just like home organs, there's not a whole bunch of people going and starting home organ companies. It kind of just passed. People are content with the digital recreations or the VSTs, and nobody's going through all the work of recreating this old style of synth. But let's take a listen, and we'll conclude with some thoughts. Let's take a listen. So what do you think? I have to admit that it surprised me. I like the way it works together. The different sections really complement each other, and it's incredibly clean sounding and pleasant. It's just pleasant to listen to, and I was surprised by that. I didn't like the SK50 terribly a lot. I thought it was okay, but this one is surprisingly rich sounding, and I'm kind of excited to explore it a little bit more. It would be really cool to have a sequencer controlling the VCO and kind of creating a pattern to play kind of backing chords to. I think that would be a fun experience. I'm also excited that we can actually mix the voices to pan and create space in the mix, and it's always fun when you have kind of 3 different sound sources to pan. So most notable things for me in this synth that I like the best, I like the effects. I like the ensemble and tremolo effects. They're analog effects, BBD chips, and I like the organ section. I like there's a percussive section that adds this kind of percussive element to the organ sounds that you can create some really nice kind of tones with that are fun. I also really like the VCO. It's a cool little monosynth to play with. It's got its own character. It's very different sounding than a lot of the other kind of monosynths that I like, the Roland or the Korg monosynths that I'm more used to hearing. It has a polysynth detune, so it allows you to kind of detune. It has 2 oscillators, and so you can detune the polysynth section, which is not something you find in the SK15, the little brother. So that makes it fattens up the polysynth sound quite a bit. But yeah, those are kind of the things that I enjoy. It works well. It's well built. It's kind of beautiful. The cabinetry is really well built. This thing's a tank. Yamaha really did a good job, like they always do in their instruments. It's very high quality, well built. So would love to hear other people's experiences with these instruments and thoughts. I might have gotten some of the history wrong or some of the technical aspects of this wrong. I think this whole genre of synth is not particularly talked about a lot and not particularly understood, I think, for people that didn't live through the era or didn't run into these type of synthesizers around in that time. So I'd love to hear people that lived through the era, what was the perception of these type of instruments, and would be open to just alternate narratives. I did my best to say how I think it went, but again, this is me reading and kind of collecting information and trying to give this information out to folks today that are interested. I personally find synthesizers fascinating and their history, and I'm always excited to discover new instruments and new sounds. I kind of like ensemble style synths. They're fun. It's like you get lost in this kind of constrained rompler, proto-rompler world. It's a lot of fun. So personally, I think it's really interesting. You can find these for pretty cheap when they come up because no one really knows what they are. There's not a lot of good information. I picked this up for right around $1,000, which I think I got a good deal on. I've seen them go anywhere from $1,000 to $3,000 online. So just not a lot of information. Part of the reason I made this video, I thought it'd be helpful for people that are looking into these and want more information. If you have any thoughts, please leave them below. We'd love to hear from you. And you can find us again at alamomusic.com. We'd love to hear from you on the chat or give us a call or send us an email. And if you didn't, I'd appreciate it if you subscribed, turn on your notifications. Thank you for watching.